I grew up in a small town in central Minnesota. I was born and raised there. So for me, as a little toddler, I learned how to figure skate on my parents' lake in the backyard. Then when I turned 10, I started being a competitive figure skater, traveling around the region and competing. My first memories of struggling with an eating disorder was at the age of 12. I started being in this competitive arena where weight was talked about quite a bit, your appearance was talked about, you were equated by how good of an athlete you were, by how small you could be. And so I became very self-conscious of my appearance, of my height, of my weight, of what costumes I had to wear at competitions. The guidance counselor actually called my parents because I'd put myself on a very restrictive diet while I was away at school during the day. And so when my parents got that call, they brought me into the pediatrician in town, and he said, yes, she has anorexia. But again, he wasn't an eating disorder specialist, and just kind of told my parents, well, just make sure, she eats breakfast before she goes to school, she eats family dinner with you all, and I'm sure it's just sort of an adolescent thing. By having anorexia, I could control my life, I could control the fate of me being a competitive athlete. Figure skating meant everything to me, and so to know that I could become a better athlete if I controlled my weight was something that I put to a very high regard. And unfortunately, less than a year later, at the age of 13, I was back in that pediatrician's office getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And that was a real devastating blow because my younger brother had been diagnosed 2.5 years before me with type 1. For me, I wanted to look like my friends, act like my friends, date the same guys that my friends did. And now I'm being brought back into this pediatrician's office being told you have type 1 diabetes, a chronic incurable illness, and there's no cure for it. And you are going to have to live with it every minute of every day of your life. And I was scared. I was a scared kid. I didn't want to go down to the nurse's office early before lunch every day. I already felt like a black sheep as a 13-year-old teenage girl. Now I really felt like a black sheep. And now I'm being told the medication that will keep me alive is going to make me fat. At 16, then I was chosen to be a national spokesperson for the Diabetes Association, where people are sort of putting you up on a pedestal, like you must take great care of yourself with diabetes, you're the epitome of health. And here I was suffering in my own silence with this big secret I had, which is I was struggling with an eating disorder and I was sick. It's really now what I was struggling with was bulimia. And so especially for me then, right, I was even more scared having the history of anorexia. So I felt like sort of cutting corners, purging, taking laxatives, over-exercising, that I was justified to use those to maintain my weight. I think I felt justified in my eating disorder behavior because I'd been diagnosed with type 1 at 13, with a disease I had no choice in getting. So I felt a lot of shame, which I think oftentimes really fuels an eating disorder as well. It wasn't until I was 24 years old that I actually got help for an eating disorder. I was at an annual exam, actually with an OBGYN who had seen that my weight had fluctuated up and down significantly. And I started speaking about more of sort of these little rules I had, what I had done to try to maintain my weight. And honestly, she finally just said, that must be a really lonely life. You must not really feel great all the time, right? Because I felt like I was just sort of masking this to show this sort of perfection of a life to people. Okay, and she said, are you at least willing to sit down and have an assessment done by an eating disorder center? Which I said yes. Went, and then it was this very long, several hour thing when then they officially diagnosed me with bulimia at 24. But it took me over 6 weeks to even then tell my family of that diagnosis. And what really motivated me was I had people in my type 1 diabetes and eating disorder group who died. What we often hear about in the eating disorder world is that in order to have an eating disorder with type 1 diabetes, they'll sometimes call it diabulimia, that your symptom of choice for the eating disorder was insulin omission. Certainly there are people with type 1 who use insulin omission, but that's not the case for everybody. And so I think for me, because that was not my symptom, I never omitted insulin. I think I went years without being diagnosed with the eating disorder because nobody flagged me because my A1C was always in a healthy range. For people who struggle with what I call and what a lot of medical professionals call the official diagnosis, which is ED-DMT1, there are specialized places that treat that. It's a very complicated co-occurring illness. So I want medical professionals to know to look past just blood sugars, just an A1C lab test, to see, does that person suffer in another way with different eating disorder symptoms? Patients or other people who are struggling with an eating disorder right now, I want them to know that there is help out there and there are places they can go to get the help that they desperately need and deserve. That's why I feel really honored to be able to team up with Center for Change. They have this full comprehensive team that knows type 1 diabetes, but they also have treated eating disorders, for 30 years. What's interesting is I never thought or dreamed of talking about eating disorders and mental health, ever. My life is so much better and richer and happier today than when I was, I'll say, in sort of my prison cell of living with an eating disorder. And so I hope that by telling my story, that people will understand that you too can have recovery in your life.